June 1944. Inside a captured French chateau, German headquarters buzzes with quiet confidence. On the tables, maps of the Atlantic coast, masterpieces of military cartography, detailing every beach, every tide, every route an enemy tank could take. The strategy, refined by Field Marshal Rommel himself, rests on a doctrine proven in countless war games. An invading army is most vulnerable in its first 48 hours. German command is certain they can throw the Allies back into the sea. Years later, the man who built the concrete behind that confidence would describe, in his own words, exactly how it failed. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, the engineer who oversaw Germany's entire coastal defense program, called what happened next an idea of simple genius. 2 years of construction, 13 million cubic meters of concrete, 1.5 million tons of steel, made irrelevant, he said, in a fortnight, because the enemy never came to fight for what the concrete was built to protect. Here is what Speer was reacting to. The entire German plan assumed one unshakable fact. An invading army needs a port. Every fortification, every gun emplacement at Cherbourg and Le Havre and Boulogne existed to make the enemy bleed for one. The Allies looked at that assumption and discarded it entirely. They didn't come to capture a port. They brought two, towed across the channel in pieces, assembled under fire, each the size of Dover, built to move thousands of tons a day, starting the moment they touched bottom. To understand why that broke something in the German mind, you have to understand exactly what they had built to stop it. By 1944, German defensive thinking had hardened into a 3-layered system, refined by a century of wargaming and hard battlefield experience. The first layer was the crust, the Atlantic wall itself. A brutal physical barrier at the water's edge, millions of tons of concrete shaped into bunkers and gun emplacements, their fields of fire interlocking so that no stretch of sand was left uncovered. Below them, the beaches were seeded with steel obstacles, teller mines, and sharpened logs the Germans called Rommel's asparagus, driven into the sand at angles designed to gut a landing craft the moment the tide brought it in. All of it built for a single purpose: break the momentum of the first assault, inflict maximum casualties, turn the shoreline into a killing ground the instant the ramps dropped. But the Germans knew the crust would eventually be breached somewhere. That's what the second layer was for. The cushion, the first few miles of French countryside behind the beach. Here, any Allied units that survived the crust, disorganized, separated from their officers, would be channeled into pre-sighted artillery zones and machine gun nests. The goal wasn't to destroy them outright. It was to pin them down, to prevent them from consolidating into a coherent force, to hold them in a state of extreme vulnerability. An army without a foothold, trapped between the sea behind them and the enemy in front. That setup led to the third and most critical layer. The hammer. Held in reserve, away from the coast, were Germany's elite panzer divisions, the armored fist of the entire defense. The logic behind them was universally accepted military doctrine. A seaborne invasion is a fragile, isolated thing. Starved of heavy equipment, starved of reinforcement, its supply line stretched across a hostile sea. German command calculated a window of 48 to 72 hours before the invaders could land enough tanks and artillery and supply to become a real threat. Inside that window, the hammer would fall. The panzers would charge to the coast and annihilate the weakened, trapped enemy, and push what was left back into the channel. It was a sound plan. It had one assumption buried inside it nobody had ever tested: that the enemy would need to fight and bleed for a working harbor before real supply could begin. The idea of simply towing a harbor into a war zone had been sketched years earlier. Winston Churchill reportedly first floated the concept as far back as the First World War, then revived it in 1942, demonstrating the underlying breakwater principle to his own staff with nothing more than paper boats and a bath brush in a hotel bathtub. More than a few Allied officers considered it faintly ridiculous at the time. 2 years of secret construction later, it wasn't. On the morning of June 6th, the reports started arriving just after midnight. Airborne landings, scattered, disorganized. It fit the profile exactly. Then, as dawn broke over the channel, came the ship sightings. Also expected. At 7th Army headquarters in Le Mans, the mood was tense, but controlled. The invasion was unfolding exactly as their war games had predicted. Then the reports kept coming, and the numbers began to swell past anything the doctrine had accounted for. A fleet wasn't sighted off one stretch of the Calvados coast. It was everywhere. Telephone lines crackled with disbelief as reports piled in. Reconnaissance pilots breaking through the cloud cover described not a naval force, but something closer to a floating city. 5 major landing zones, not 1 or 2. Paratroopers scattered far beyond where the cushion zone was supposed to catch them. The count climbed from dozens of ships to hundreds, and then to something approaching impossible. Nearly 7,000 vessels crossing the channel at once. The plan had been built to counter a precise, surgical strike. It was facing a flood, and the generals staring at the map that morning couldn't answer the one question the entire doctrine depended on. Where was the main effort? Which beach was the real one? While German command stood paralyzed over their maps, a different kind of army was already hitting the sand, and its primary weapon wasn't a rifle. It was the bulldozer. Within hours of the first wave, specialized units, the U.S. Navy Seabees and British Royal Engineers, came ashore with a mission that had nothing to do with capturing bunkers. Their job was to re-engineer the French coastline under direct enemy fire. On Omaha, where the infantry was pinned down and bleeding on the shingle, combat engineers packed explosives into the beach obstacles and blew gaps clean through, carving crude exit ramps where none existed. Then came armored bulldozers, built to shrug off small arms fire, shoving aside wrecked vehicles and dead men's equipment, clearing the only paths off a beach that was still being shelled. The whine of their engines joined the noise of the battle itself, construction running alongside destruction in the same square mile. These men weren't just clearing what Rommel had planted. They were building roads where no roads existed, laying steel matting so trucks wouldn't sink into wet sand, turning a beachhead into the skeleton of a working port, while men were still dying on it. The cushion, the layer meant to pin down and grind up whatever survived the crust, was already failing at the waterline before the main battle had even properly begun. At Omaha's Easy Red sector, Ensign Lawrence Karnowski, a young officer with Naval Combat Demolition Unit 45, landed at 6:25 that morning with orders to blast lanes through the exact obstacles Rommel's doctrine depended on. German gunners held their fire until his ramp dropped, then opened up with 88mm cannon and machine guns directly on his unit and every boat behind it. Karnowski's men wired their charges into the obstacles anyway, in the open, at the waterline, in full view of the gun positions on the bluffs above. When the tide came in faster than expected and cut the work short, Karnowski didn't pull back. He stayed on the exposed beach to drag wounded men out of the water and get them evacuated, an act that earned him the Navy Cross. Men like Karnowski weren't just surviving the crust and the cushion. They were dismantling both, piece by hand, while German command was still arguing over which beach mattered. 20 miles inland, the hammer never fell. Part of the delay was command chaos. Rommel himself was in Germany, home for his wife's birthday. Key commanders were away at a war game exercise in Rennes. And at his remote headquarters, Hitler refused to release the strategic reserve at all, convinced Normandy was a diversion for a larger attack still coming at Calais. But the most decisive factor of all was in the sky, and the sky was completely, utterly owned by the Allies. For a German tank crew, daylight had become a death sentence. Allied P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons, the Germans called them jabots, circled overhead like they were hunting. Any movement on a road, a single tank, a truck, a staff car, brought a screaming dive and a salvo of rockets and cannon fire. The panzers could only creep forward at night, hiding in forest, cover by day. The 48-hour window, the one the entire defensive doctrine had been built around, slammed shut without the hammer ever landing a real blow. The invasion wasn't being contained. It was growing. Then came the reconnaissance photographs that broke what was left of German command's grip on the situation. Off Arromanches and Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, something impossible was taking shape. These were the Mulberry harbors, codenamed Gooseberries and Phoenixes, among the most audacious engineering feats of the entire war. Colossal concrete caissons, each the size of a 5-story building, towed across the channel and sunk in place to form a breakwater out of nothing. Floating piers, miles of them, snaking from the beach out to docking heads where Liberty ships unloaded cargo directly onto French soil. This was what Speer would later call simple genius. And in the moment, for the officers actually watching it rise out of the water, it read closer to disbelief. An army was supposed to seize a port. It wasn't supposed to bring one in its back pocket. It violated every known rule of amphibious warfare they had spent years preparing for. It wasn't flawless. On the night of June 18th, a storm, the worst to hit the Normandy coast in decades, tore through the channel for nearly 4 days straight. The American harbor at Omaha, Mulberry, was wrecked beyond repair. Block ships smashed apart, pontoon causeways twisted and broken, landing craft thrown up onto the beach above the high water mark. It was never rebuilt. What could be salvaged was stripped and shipped to the British harbor at Arromanches, which went on working for another 10 months. Some historians argue the American Mulberry was never strictly necessary at all, pointing out that landing ships beaching directly moved more tonnage in the end than the harbor at Omaha ever managed. It's a fair argument. It also misses what those 3 uninterrupted weeks of buildup before the storm ever hit had already made possible. With the artificial harbors in place, the trickle of supply became a torrent. By the end of June, just over 3 weeks after the landings, the Allies had put more than 850,000 men ashore. With them came nearly 150,000 vehicles, tanks, jeeps, ambulances, and thousands of trucks, and over 570,000 tons of supplies. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical equipment, spare parts. A mountain range of material moving on a fixed schedule. Plans were already underway for the Red Ball Express, a continuous loop of truck convoys that would soon feed the armies racing across France. Engineers were preparing to lay Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, to pump fuel directly from Britain to the front line without a single tanker ship at risk. The German soldier in his foxhole was still fighting bravely against American and British platoons. Germany as a nation was being defeated by an enemy that measured victory in tons per hour. Every tank the Germans destroyed was replaced by 2 more. Every crate of ammunition spent was answered by a shipload. For the German generals, the physical evidence was already terrifying. The endless truck columns, the ships queued at the artificial harbors, skies black with Allied aircraft. But the true shape of their defeat wasn't found on a map or in a reconnaissance photograph. It was found in a dry intelligence summary. By the first week of July, that summary landed on the desks of German High Command. It wasn't a battlefield assessment. It was closer to an autopsy, written in the flat language of logistics. Analysts had finally consolidated the numbers and calculated the Allied rate of deployment. And the figures were catastrophic. An average of 28,000 men and 5,000 vehicles landing on the Normandy coast every single day. The entire premise behind the Atlantic Wall, the entire 48-hour doctrine, collapsed under the weight of that one number. Any tactical success in the field was now irrelevant. A panzer commander could fight a brilliant action, destroy an entire Allied battalion, and it would change nothing. Because the reports proved the Allies could replace every man and every vehicle from the sea within days. That realization was distilled soon after into a single devastating chart. On July 19th, it was placed in front of Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had just replaced Rommel as Commander-in-Chief West. There was no complex analysis attached to it, just 2 lines on a grid. The top line, total Allied strength in Normandy, climbed relentlessly day after day, a diagonal slash moving up and to the right, with no sign of slowing. It was the industrial flood made visible. The bottom line was his own combat power, a mirror image, a steep and agonizing decline, each dip a lost panzer, a shattered battalion, a convoy that never arrived. In that quiet headquarters, the war in France ended for von Kluge. Not in a blaze of tactical glory or a single blunder, but in the silent acceptance of a mathematical verdict. His soldiers could fight with everything they had, and it would not move those 2 lines by a single degree. Albert Speer spent the war pouring concrete to guarantee that an invading army would have to fight and bleed for a harbor before it could be properly supplied. He spent his post-war years explaining, in his own words, exactly how that concrete lost its purpose in a matter of days. Not because German soldiers fought poorly, and not because the doctrine itself was foolish, but because the enemy he was defending against had simply never intended to fight by those rules at all. Simple genius, he called it. He wasn't wrong. He was just the man left standing over 13 million cubic meters of concrete that no longer had anywhere left to matter.